Imagine a world where two giants are fighting over trade. A world where tariffs and taxes are used as weapons to hurt each other's economies. A world where the fate of billions of people depends on the outcome of this conflict. It's terrible, right? It will not happen. Come, let's find out why. China and the United States are the two largest economies in the world. They have a lot of trade and investment ties, which means they buy and sell a lot of goods and services from each other. Trade is usually good for both countries because it allows them to get what they need or want at lower prices and creates more jobs and income. A trade war is when two countries impose tariffs or taxes on each other's goods to make them more expensive and less competitive in the market. Tariffs are usually used to protect domestic industries from foreign competition or to punish another country for unfair trade practices. However, trade wars can also have a negative consequence on both sides, such as higher prices, lower demand, reduced profits, and job losses. Trade wars can also affect other countries that are involved in global trade and supply chains. China and the US are the two largest economies in the world, and they have a complex and interdependent trade relationship. They buy and sell a lot of goods and services from each other, such as electronics, clothing, machinery, agricultural products, and entertainment. They also invest in each other's businesses and markets, such as stocks, bonds, real estate, and technology. They also cooperate on many global issues, such as climate change, security, and health. However, China and the US also have many disagreements and conflicts over trade and other matters. The US accuses China of unfair trade practices such as stealing intellectual property, subsidizing state-owned enterprises, manipulating its currency, and dumping cheap products. The US also wants China to open up its market more to American businesses and to respect human rights and democracy. China accuses the US of protectionism, interference, bullying, and trying to contain its rise as a global power. China also wants the US to respect its sovereignty and interests in the region to cooperate on global challenges. In 2018, the US started a trade war with China by imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The US said that these tariffs were meant to force China to change its trade practices and to reduce the trade deficit between the two countries. The trade deficit is when one country imports more than it exports to another country. The US said that this deficit was hurting its economy and workers. China retailed by imposing tariffs on American goods and taking other measures to counter the US actions. The trade war escalated through 2019 and affected many sectors and industries in both countries. In 2020, the two sides reached a preliminary deal called the Phase 1 Agreement. In this agreement, China promised to buy more American goods and services, especially agricultural products, energy, and manufactured goods. China also agreed to strengthen its intellectual property protection and enforcement, refrain from currency manipulation, and improve its market access for American businesses. The US agreed to reduce some of the tariffs it has imposed on Chinese goods and to suspend further tariff increases. The Phase 1 agreement was seen as a positive step towards easing the trade tensions between the two countries. However, the Phase 1 agreement did not resolve all the issues and disputes between China and the US. Some of the most difficult topics, such as industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, cybersecurity, human rights, and geopolitical rivalry, were left for a second phase of negotiations. However, these negotiations have not progressed much due to various factors, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, political changes in the US, and increased tensions over Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, South China Sea, and other areas. Therefore, it is unlikely that China and the US will go into a full-scale trade war anytime soon. Both sides have realized that a trade war is costly and harmful to their economies and to the global economy. Both sides have also recognized that they need each other for trade, investment, innovation, and cooperation on many common challenges. Both sides have also faced pressure from their domestic consultations and international partners to avoid further escalation of the trade conflict. However, it is also unlikely that China and the US will reach a comprehensive and lasting trade agreement in the near future. The two countries have different economic systems, political values, strategic interests, and historical experiences that shape their views on trade and other issues. The two countries have also different expectations and demands from each other that are difficult to reconcile or compromise. The two countries also have different levels of trust and confidence in each other's intentions and actions. Therefore, it is more likely that China and the US will continue to have a mixed relationship that involves both competition and cooperation on trade and other matters. The two countries will try to manage their differences through dialogue and negotiation, while pursuing their interests through various means. The two countries will also try to balance their bilateral relationship with their multilateral engagements with other countries and organizations. China can't go to a trade war with the United States because it would hurt others more than it would help itself. China is part of a global economy that is interconnected and interdependent. Suppose China goes into a trade war with the United States. In that case, it will disrupt the global trade system that benefits many countries and regions. It would also damage the global economic growth that relies on many factors and forces. It would also endanger the global peace and security that depends on many rules and norms. David Autor is an economist who studies how trade affects workers and communities. He's done a lot of research on the impact of trade with China on the US economy, especially on the manufacturing jobs and regions. He calls this impact the China shock. The China shock started in 1992 when China opened up its economy to the world and began to export a lot of cheap goods to the US. The China shock ended in 2010 when China's share of US imports stopped growing. During this period, the US lost millions of manufacturing jobs and many regions suffered from lower incomes, higher unemployment, and more dependence on government benefits. Autor and his colleagues found that the China shock was very large and very persistent. They found that the regions that were more exposed to Chinese imports did not recover or adjust well, even after many years. They found that the workers who lost their jobs did not move to other places or find new jobs easily. They found that consumers who benefited from cheaper goods did not gain enough to offset the losses of the workers and communities. Autor also found that the China shock was very uneven and very unfair. He found that the regions that were more affected by Chinese imports were those that had fewer college-educated workers that were more specialized in certain industries. He found that the workers who lost their jobs were mostly older, less educated, and less skilled. He found that the China shock increased inequality and polarization in the US. Autor thinks that the China shock was not inevitable or desirable. He thinks that the US government did not do enough to help the workers and communities that were hurt by trade with China, and that the US should have negotiated better trade deals with China, enforced its trade rules more strictly, and protected its intellectual property rights more effectively. He also thinks that the US should have invested more in education, training infrastructure, Ducatis, and social safety nets for its workers and communities. He does not think that trade with China is bad or wrong. According to the World Bank, the GDP of America in 2022 was $25.462.70 billion, which means that the United States made about $25 trillion that year. This was a 9.21% increase from 2021, which means that the United States made more money in 2022 than in 2021. The GDP of America in 2022 was also the highest in the world, which means that the United States was the richest country in the world. The GDP of America in 2022 was equal to 11.20% of the world's GDP, which means that the United States made more than 1/10 of the world's money in that year. According to the reports from the World Bank, the GDP of China in 2022 was $17.963.17 billion, which means that China made about $18 trillion in that year. This was a 0.8% increase from 2021, which means that China made more money in 2022 than in 2021. The GDP of China in 2022 was also the second highest in the world, which means that China was the second richest country in the world. The GDP of China in 2022 was equal to 7.97% of the world's GDP, which means that China made almost 1/10 of the world's money in that year. China and the US are locked in a trade dispute that could escalate into a full-blown war. But what if they both realize that they have more to lose than gain from this conflict? It would be good news! Comment your thoughts on this and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.